They said the palace smelled of saffron and cedar, that tapestries drank the light and returned only flattering shadows. In the cooling corridor, the scent was wrong, metallic under the incense, like iron soaked in honey. A girl of 12 sat on a low stool while women with quiet hands smoothed oil across her shoulders, speaking names that sounded like prayers and sentences that sounded like sentences of sale. Her hair smelled of smoke and pomegranate, her palms felt the cold of polished marble, and there was a thin sound of a flute barely audible through the curtains. They called her princess, but she knew every title was an inventory. She did not fear death, she feared what they made of life. To understand what King Xerxes did to his own daughters, worse than death and its cruelty, we must follow the records, the bones, and the silences. If you want to uncover how grandeur becomes a machine of erasure, support this channel with a like and subscribe for more investigations. The story begins not in one night, but in a long education of entitlement, when a boy was taught that lineage meant rights, when rituals replaced tenderness and law became theater. It is a story of a court that learned to think of daughters as policy, and of a kingdom that justified cruelty as necessity. Who guards the vulnerable when power makes them property is the question we will try to answer. These are lives that deserve names and remembrance. Xerxes was not born monstrous in a single moment. He was the son of tutors and triumphal processions, raised to hear verses about destiny and to sleep under banners that called him lord of many lands. His childhood room smelled of ink and dust, of wax seals and the sweet rot of dried fruit in wooden bowls. As a young man, he watched his father place crowns on defeated rivals and felt no pity. Darius, the court scribe, wrote of his appetite for absolutes. Mitra, the eunuch, remembered lessons given in a small study where Xerxes learned to equate obedience with loyalty. Early signs were small and domestic. A tutor named Farhad corrected a child who lingered too long with a servant girl, and Xerxes answered with a look that made the girl vanish from feasts. The formation of his rule mixed theology and pedagogy, sermons about divine order and practices that demanded exactitude in submission. Power became a habit, and habit hardened into ritual. Roxana was the daughter who tried to carry memory like a badge of refusal. Her backstory is important because it reveals how intimacy and brutality lived in the same bedchamber. She was born beneath a thin moon in the palace quarter that smelled of boiled lentils and wet stone. As a toddler, she learned to count by watching soldiers' boots, and by 6 she could read the numerals on tax lists alongside a tutor named Jahan. Her mother, a woman called Zara, taught her to string small glass beads and to hear secrets in the clink of glass. Roxana loved the taste of sour plums and the sound of rain on the eastern loggia. But the court taught her shapes of silence as well. By 9, she had seen men praised for breaking a boy at wrestling to prove toughness, and she learned that questions could be punished with exile. At 12, she felt the palace as both a classroom and a prison. The nurse who bound her hair, a woman named Laleh, hummed lullabies that smelled of rosewater and iron. Roxana kept a small stitch of rebellion in a pocket, a scrap of a poem scratched on a bone. She was not the only girl shaped this way. Her sisters Afsaneh and Mina and cousins Samira and Darush mirrored the same trait of affection for influence. The backstory shows how a child taught to be a symbol could become a casualty of politics without any public law record to mark the crime. Xerxes rose in triumph across rivers and valleys. Publicly, he was a builder who filled the plain with columns and amphitheaters. The campaign imagery was fragrant and loud. Parades sounded like thunder and smelled of tar and horse sweat. Arash, the general, orchestrated victories whose banners fluttered with gold dust. In public speeches, Xerxes spoke of unity and of protecting the realm. His voice carried through the square like a bell. He presented daughters as extensions of alliance, as living treaties, and the palace displayed them with jeweled collars and embroidered veils. The court chroniclers praised marriages arranged to seal loyalties. And the archives show ledgers with generous portions allocated to girls' dowries while no line recorded their consent. In caravan camps, incense burned, camels ground their teeth, and foreign emissaries tasted the rich saffron breads that signaled welcome. The public story was one of magnanimity and order, but every cited mercy hid coercion that only the walls could witness. Defeats began to erode that public face. When rivers failed in the north and a season of poor harvests coincided with a naval loss, Xerxes' image cracked. The people smelled smoke from burned granaries and heard the hollow drum of unpaid soldiers. Crowds that once applauded now muttered at the market stalls, spitting seeds and picturing different fathers. Darius the scribe recorded the first protests as small scrawls added to petitions. Mitra the eunuch noted a change in the king, a thinness around the eyes, a tendency to yell at pictures in the maps room. At court, the laughter stopped and the servants closed shutters earlier. The king, who had equated dissent with treason, began to look inward for traitors. He moved blame from campaigns to families, and daughters who symbolized alliance became instruments of blame to recalibrate loyalty. Public losses made private punishments seem plausible to those who feared the ripple of revolution. The descent into domestic tyranny was gradual and then sudden, like a tide that reveals a jagged shore. Palace rooms with polished cedar and cushions torn at the seams filled with new procedures. Guards who once exchanged polite bows now practiced interrogations in the shadowed portico. The harem, once a place of ceremonial beauty with jasmine and music, became an apparatus for control. The palace kitchens smelled of cumin and burned bread, while corridors echoed with the measured steps of those who practiced cruel rituals as administration. Xerxes developed routines that institutionally erased dissent. Nights of inspection where daughters were paraded, inventories of behavior signed by eunuchs, and the use of spectral accusations to justify removal from favor. The stories from courtiers recorded arbitrary punishments with the same bureaucratic calm as tax entries. A moment is worth pausing on, a tension that captured the inner conflict of those who served. Zara, the mother, remembered bending over a cradle and thinking of the ledger, and Arash, the general, felt his oath to the state crack against the sight of a child cuffed for a rumor. These tensions turned bones brittle and promises hollow. The apparatus of violence was both spatial and administrative. There was an inner ward that few saw, a place of rooms with sand floors and small barred windows. A space the court called the confessional, though it functioned like a registry of obedience. The palace magistrate, a man named Bilal, kept a list of transgressions stamped and dated. Mitra the eunuch received secret orders each dawn and translated them into punishments that ranged from confinement to forced marriages to symbolic humiliations meant to teach future loyalty. Names moved through this machine. Roxana was sent to a room where the air tasted of lemon and iron, and Afsaneh was given a contract presented on a wooden tablet that smelled faintly of cedar and ink. The guards, Zubin and Kaveh, walked their rounds with boots that slapped like verdicts on stone. The complicit network contained craftsmen, cooks, scribes, and priests, people like Darius and Lele and Farhad. Each had a role and a plausible deniability that functioned as their alibi. Here we will pause and ask you to speak. You have just heard how institutions can hide crimes. Tell us in the comments which detail stays with you more. Start your comment with victim, confession, or discovery. Each response helps this investigation and could point to sources that break further silence. Testimonies began to leak, and one witness changed everything. A man named Hamed, an excavator turned farmer, found a small bone fragment outside the necropolis and took it to Layla, a young archaeologist with a tendency to ask blunt questions. Layla smelled dust and iron at the dig site and felt the hair on her arms rise. The fragment had incision marks that did not match communal burial rites. Layla asked questions in whispers to protect sources. The first major turning point came when Mitra, perhaps haunted, told a servant in a tavern the outline of a practice that placed daughters in intermediary households as leverage. The confession was short and messy. Conversation at a safe table went like this. Layla said, "What did you find at the site?" And Hamid answered, "Bones, and bone with cuts." And Layla asked, "Where did they come from?" And Hamid looked at the floor and said, "Near the eastern wall by the old water channel." And Layla pressed, "Did anyone else know?" And Hamid swallowed, "A captain, a nurse, and a scribe. Names are Arash, Lale, and Darius." Those exchanges changed the tone of the inquiry and planted the seed of conspiracy. Tension mounted into decision in several crucial scenes. The first moment of tension was the discovery room, where Layla and Hamid confronted the magistrate Bilal with the fragment. Bilal, whose hands were stained with ledger ink, tried to name paperwork rather than people. Layla pressed her palms against the small bone, and the air smelled like battery acid and old cloth. Bilal thought of his pension and his children, and remembered how he had once kissed a child who smiled like the moon. He chose institutional language and refused to speak names. That refusal felt like a physical blow to Layla, and she remembered the feel of rain on her face as a child, and the way the world promised honesty. The second moment was a private corridor where Zara, Roxana's mother, had a secret exchange with Arash the general. Zara said, "You swore to protect the family." And Arash replied, "I swore to protect the realm." And she said, "The realm uses our daughters as currency." And he said, "The realm eats its pieces to survive." And she had to decide whether to betray the court or her child. The third moment of tension was the night of the conspiracy. A small group met in the stables smelling of hay and horse sweat. Names moved like whispers. Darius, the scribe, whose nose always caught the scent of lemon oil, argued that evidence must be public. Mitra, trembling, argued secrecy. They weighed the cost of exposure against the cost of silence, and then chose action. The conspiracy was careful and cruel in equal measure. It involved conversations and counter-conversations. One planning scene contains dialogue that shows the weight of moral decision. Darius said, "We can take the archives to the market and publish." And Mitra said, "They will execute us and burn the papers." And Darius answered, "We will need witnesses." And Lale replied, "I will testify that I saw men sign tablets." And Arash said, "I will secure the eastern gate." And Roxana, who listened, said, "I will speak my name." And the room inhaled. There were 6 exchanges in that chamber, each sentence thick with fear and resolve. The conspirators prepared false ledgers, secret testimonies, and burial petitions that would lead forensic attention to the necropolis where bones had been hidden beneath ceremonial tiles. They timed everything to a festival night when the king would be distracted by pageantry and when guards would be taught to look away. The climactic night smelled of smoke from celebratory torches and the clatter of drums. Inside the palace, the conspirators moved with the kind of anxious politeness that could look like guest behavior. They spoke in hushed tones as they exchanged tokens and ledgers. The tension paragraphs here become sequences of memory and decision. A guard named Zubin remembered his mother and thought of shame. A young scribe felt the weight of the tablet in his arms like an accusation. When the action unfolded, there were hard choices to make, and at least 2 people who had prepared to sacrifice reputation refused to act at the last moment, substituting fear for courage. The plan nearly failed, but the fragment evidence reached Layla outside the walls, and she placed it under the care of a caravan headed toward Allied scholars. The aftermath was messy. Some conspirators were discovered, punished in ways that read like ceremonial cleansing, while others escaped into exile. The king reacted with a mixture of fury and performative mourning, proclaiming investigations that smelled more like smokescreens than truth. The consequences were part concealment and part revelation. Excavations later found a cluster of internments beneath a ceremonial floor where only honored dead should lie. Forensic work by Layla and a forensic anthropologist named Farhad showed cut marks inconsistent with ritual, but consistent with control, with bindings and signs of long confinement. Archaeologists using careful stratigraphy recovered items with names scratched in parity with court ledgers.
The archive revealed entries that matched stomach-turning accounts of daughters removed from households and placed in dependency contracts. There were official proclamations and then quiet graves. The epilogue must be heard in 3 times. 1 month after the disclosures, the city smelled of smoke and scandal. The market stalls whispered, and some officials were arrested, while others received silent promotions. 1 year later, a tribunal convened that read selective charges and closed many files with convenient amnesties, but it also forced changes in palace procedures, minimal but material, and families that had been used as leverage began to demand legal reforms. 6 years on, the memory settled into a contested past. Some monuments remained, inscriptions were redacted, and the daughters reclaimed names in private memoirs and in small family ceremonies. Archaeological reports were published, the bones reinterred with names that historians had recovered from ledgers, and a new generation of scholars, led by Layla and Hamed, taught ethics that questioned the use of kin as policy. The moral remains harsh. The kingdom kept its columns and its parades, but the ledger of conscience had been opened. This is not only a story about one ruler. It is a lesson in how institutions can turn human beings into instruments of statecraft, and how beauty can be used as a veneer to conceal systematic cruelty. The discoveries remind us that archives, bones, and confessionals will sometimes contradict the official script. Remember the faces. Roxana, Afsaneh, Mina, Samira, and others were more
than symbols. They were persons whose names were taken and then returned by the patient work of witnesses, archaeologists, and civil servants who decided that silence had a cost. If this investigation moved you, share this video so that more people learn how power can rend private lives. Subscribe if you want more episodes that unearth the buried traces of authority and give voice to the ones history tried to erase. Because the true measure of a civilization is not its monuments, but the care it takes for its most vulnerable.